Hello and welcome. I'm Danielle Ofri, editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review. BLR is a literary journal that publishes poetry, fiction, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. Thank you so much for joining us today for Book Talk, BLR's series exploring books that touch upon these themes. And I'm so pleased to be joined by Doris W. Cheng, BLR's assistant fiction editor.
Thank you, Danielle. Myung-Ok Lee is a Korean-American writer whose stories and essays have been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Slate, Salon, Guernica, and The Guardian. Marie was the first Fulbright scholar to Korea in creative writing and is a founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop. In addition to being a judge for BLR's Goldenberg Prize for Fiction, Marie is the author of the acclaimed young adult novels Finding My Voice and Saying Goodbye. She joins us today to discuss her latest novel, The Evening Hero, a sweeping and deeply observed and compassionate story about a Korean War survivor turned OBGYN who is forced to confront secrets from his past. Welcome, Marie.
Well, thank you so much, Danielle, Dora. So nice to meet you, and I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, us too. We're so excited to talk about your novel. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that really struck me as I was reading was just the sweep of it and the broad range of things you train your writer's eye upon, from the conglomeration of hospitals and commercialization of medicine to immigrant life in rural America to the Korean War and its far-reaching effects. Can you start off by telling us about the germ of your story? How did all these different elements come together to form the narrative?
Sure. Kirkus Reviews actually, during their interview, they said, this book seems like it's actually like three books stapled together, but in a good way. And actually that is kind of almost what the book was. The germ of it started with, I wanted to do something about a doctor who tries to do the right thing, but it ends up having really weird repercussions. It was kind of based on Middlemarch. The doctor character lives in a small town and he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to keep up with medicine, but he accidentally murders someone who everyone else is trying to murder. And I kind of like that idea. And so actually the first round was Jungmat being involved in a medical malpractice suit. And so I ended up writing this whole book, and then it kind of didn't quite fit the feeling that I wanted. So I kind of went back to the drawing board, and then it just went more into his immigrant story. And it ended up being more of a gentler thing, but at the same time, it made me realize how, because my father is also a physician, how much I was nostalgic and sort of enraged by the fact that people can't practice the kind of medicine, the small town medicine that my own father practiced. And at the same time, too, after the 2016 election, when a lot of the anti-Asian hate was going on, there were a lot of there was a lot of that went on in my town, which made me feel like people did not realize. So my father was an anesthesiologist, and he just touched, he literally touched everyone in the town if they had an accident or surgery or childbirth. And sort of between the anti-immigrant sentiment and the anti-North Korean, someone actually had a bumper sticker that they were displaying that was calling for like genocide of North Koreans. And I just felt like, you don't even know this person who was my father, that, he was such a pillar of the town. So I kind of it kind of went from this, I'm going to have this sort of idea driven novel about this physician who tries to do the right thing, to more open-ended about this doctor and how did he end up like this, and why does he just look like a little Asian man to everybody else, but he's had this huge epic story, not just of immigration but of migration, of how did he get out of North Korea, like what did he suffer during the Korean War, and what is the secret that he left behind, and everyone thinks he's so beloved, but he did a really bad thing when he was back in Korea. So a lot of it made me think about, how can one person do all of that and contain all of these multitudes?
As a doctor myself, I was really taken with how Jungman is as a physician. He's very old school, in a certain way. And I know that you are a daughter of a doctor and grew up in kind of a medical family. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a bit about growing up in a medical family, and then maybe you can read to us a bit from your book about Jungman as a physician in the beginning, when it talks about what a sort of typical day at work is.
Sure. I think for me, it was two things. One is my father literally, the night before surgery, would go to all his patients, sit there with them, and not as long as they wanted. So a lot of times they're really scared and lonely. So for me, that meant I never saw my father at home. he was almost never home. And, there were no holidays and so forth. So that was like the one part that I saw. But the other part was just the reactions we'd see, when we were out, like, oh, Dr. Lee, like, here's my gallbladder scar, and just seeing like what sort of like the texture of what he was to the community. And, because health affects everybody. So it was kind of a two-pronged thing. And then also because of the four siblings, I don't know why, but my father, in Korea, being a doctor is probably the most prestigious, like most honored profession. And for some reason, my father thought I was going to be the doctor in the family. So I spent so much of my young life, like when I was 3, saying, I'm going to become a nephrologist. I want to do this. And having like this visible woman as a toy and just getting these drawings of the soleus from my father. Like I just felt like that was going to be me, and not really understanding actually what being a doctor meant. Like, when I realized in college, when I flunked out of inorganic chemistry, that was not my path, but that was something my father just so had his heart set on. So to some degree, there's so much emotion about this book about me missing being a doctor in some ways. My father's passed on, but so much of the emotion is I did become a doctor in my own weird way, in order to write this book.
Right. So you sort of play one on TV.
Exactly. Like, don't take this as medical advice.
I'm basically just going to start at the beginning in an early scene, and the chapter is called William Y. Quack MD, Horse's Breath, Minnesota, 2000 XX. Jungmann's office was strategically placed between the surgical suites and the labor and delivery rooms. He walked by the imaging room, whose door had a sign that said, "Please do not smoke during your ultrasound." Then through a door with a sign that said, "Maternity ward," and "Push, push, push" above its automatic opener. The heavy door kept the noise of the ambulances out, but Jungmann was always imagining he heard sirens. Then he remembered the letter. He patted his jacket pocket. Whew, still dry. He opened the slim middle drawer of his desk and placed it in the back, behind his RX pad and stash of Tic Tacs. He checked the ER whiteboard. His longtime patient, Mrs. Mackey, had called him at home this morning complaining of indigestion. She wasn't due for 2 more weeks, but she tended to deliver fast. 3 children, each labor faster than the previous. So he told her to come in. Better safe in the hospital than sorry, especially since with recent budget cuts, there were fewer ambulances. Of course, this would add to his workload. Normally, Maud, his nurse midwife, could do the workup and monitoring, but there'd been sporadic layoffs for months. It had seemed there was no more flesh to cut, but she had been a casualty of last week's Friday night massacre, along with Kate Javarina, the hospital's social worker. Synergistic Action Network U.S. Health Systems had made the tantalizing promise to the Board of Trustees that Horse's Breath General would be debt-free in a mere 2 to 5 years, despite the precipitously aging and dwindling population of the town. The hospital could regain its former stability if they gave the CEO, Tinklenberg, free rein to do his magic. But all they'd seen so far were fewer staff, fewer supplies. Even basics like IV saline and Tylenol were troublingly often in short supply. Telephone problems, which used to get fixed right away, languished for days. Also, their ER had been downgraded one trauma level, then another. The new sign at the entrance read, "Minor injury only, not 24-hour. For emergency, please dial 911. The Finnish name Mackey was by far the most common surname in the town. Whether on the ER whiteboard, in the high school honor roll, in the paper, or the phone book, Jungmann was continually squinting into a thicket of Mackeys. And there she was, Lorraine Mackey, the one who had called this morning. "Hello, Mrs. Mackey." He was pleased to see her already hooked up to the fetal heart monitor, the 2 sensors correctly placed. "Guess it wasn't just the hot dish, huh?" She burped delicately. He watched the monitor. She was in labor, all right. The baby's heartbeat flattened and then bounced back nicely after each contraction. No decels. An uneventful, advancing delivery. He often became crampy himself when it was time to push. He felt faint twinges in his pelvic area now. This baby would be out by early afternoon. Jungmann made sure she had plenty of ice chips to chew on and told her to call a nurse if she wasn't comfortable. "Hello, Patsy," Jungmann said to his nurse. Were you the one who wrote FedEx on the whiteboard? I heard she delivers fast. Get it? I do get it, said Young Man. He was not always happy about the lingo the ER staff used among themselves. So many staff were talking about raccoons recently. He thought there was some kind of infestation before figuring out that raccoons was what they called opiate overdoses for the dark shadows and hollows users had around their eyes. But each department had its own way, and he needed to operate within the ER's parameters to coexist with his medical brethren. Ken, the internist, glanced at the ER board as he passed. Mrs. Mackey is a FedEx? Same day delivery, called Patsy. In utero, the baby was Young Mom's responsibility. Ex utero, Ken's. The two men had a well oiled handoff routine. It helped that the two doctors not only respected each other, but were also best friends. I'd plan on as early as mid afternoon, Young Mom said, returning to his office. Rose, his secretary, had slipped a schedule on Young Man's desk. Today was clinic day. Every slot was taken. He'd have to finish his morning inpatient rounds promptly, then get started on the lineup of women who needed birth control, STD checks, annual exams. He liked to complain about how busy he was, especially lately. But the truth was, he loved his work. Even in a small way, he mattered.
Wow, that's really beautiful. And I would just ask the audience to hold on to this image of Jungmann at work, because we'll return to this a little bit later in our program.
Just to switch gears, I just wanted to ask, in your bio, you mentioned that you're one of a handful of American journalists to be granted a visa to North Korea. And you wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times about your mother growing up in North Korea and her perilous journey over the 38th parallel, led by smugglers and arriving in Seoul with nothing but a few gold rings sewn into her clothes. And she had to leave her family behind and didn't even get to say goodbye to her own mother. So, can you tell us more about your family connection to the region and your experience when you were in North Korea? And how did your visit there shape the trajectory of your story?
Sure. I had always done the North Korean part. And so my impetus was to, as with everything in the book, I kind of feel like, for instance, how do I know how surgery works if I don't know how the surgeon holds the scalpel? I felt like I really needed to go to North Korea to just experience it if I could, which was probably kind of, it seemed almost like an impossible thing to be able to do. Um, but I kind of kept my eyes and ears open for opportunities. And what had happened is it's almost impossible for diaspora Koreans to go to North Korea, because if it's the best place in the whole world, why do Koreans exist outside of that? So I'd already kind of exempted myself. Like that was just an extra hurdle. They also don't want journalists going into North Korea. But however, um, a bunch of Brown students, when I was teaching there in East Asian Studies, had found a fixer in China. They were students who were studying Chinese. This fixer had offered to bring them into North Korea, and they needed two faculty like chaperones. So I immediately volunteered, and then I also, because of my mother, kind of tried to sneak her on the trip as well. And we kind of front loaded this whole idea that this wasn't going to work. But what ended up happening is, yes, the North Koreans did become interested in my mother and me as Koreans. And they had asked for more information about our family, which normally would have been the point at which we would have been denied a visa. My father, before he passed away, had gone in with some Christian groups to try to go into North Korea to bring equipment, a little bit like Young Man does with Doctors Without Borders. And each time he was always stopped in Beijing, and he was the only Korean doctor, and everyone would go on without him. There was never any explanation, but it was pretty obvious. And this happened to him like 2-3 times.
I'm really intrigued in your book about the theme of immigration and becoming American. And Jungmann's process of becoming American, for him, involves turning his back on his past. He wouldn't even speak Korean anymore. And you wrote at one point, quote, "This was the value of being an immigrant in America. The future was what mattered. The past was immaterial. You could be what you wanted to be, a self-made man." But despite this optimism, he contends with unresolved grief and guilt for what took place in North Korea. He and he still retains a relationship to the physical place, the earth of his home village, where his ancestors are buried, where his responsibilities as an eldest son, had taken place. And how do you see the role of memory in assimilation? Do you think that assimilating for immigrants requires, to a certain extent, forgetting where one came from?
I think all immigrants try to do that to some degree. And I actually feel like there's a certain violence in that kind of forgetting, or that kind of almost like an amputation of parts of yourself. So you're trying to fit in. And one thing that was about memory, and I'm glad that you brought that up, is one of the reasons the book took so long was because there was some editorial ideas that it should be written chronologically, and because it's such a big book, and Youngman starts here and then he ends up here. But then I knew just very fiercely that that's not the way his memory is working. His memory is he's trying to remake himself, and then at the weirdest times stuff comes rushing back, despite his kind of like trying to hold it back into this kind of reservoir or the dark corner of his mind.
Yeah, thank you. That really resonated with me, because I'm also an immigrant, and just sort of the way people have this narrative of immigration without really thinking about the larger global forces that are causing people to move from one place to another. And that's really a big part of why that happens. And just speaking of memory, in the book, the memories that Jungmann has, the wartime section is so vivid. I mean, that flashback is just so, it's as real as what's happening in the present time. It's so emotionally alive, and we are completely immersed in the daily life of people whose country is overrun and co-opted by global powers for their own political purposes. And it very clearly does make the point that the division of North and South was arbitrary. And Jungmann says at one point, why should we consider Korea as North and South when we never thought of it that way ourselves? Families were divided and people's connection to the land severed, and families were not able to honor their ancestors as they were required. So there was a tremendous wound that was created and tremendous suffering. Um, I'm curious, what kind of research did you have to do to get this kind of very layered and intimate portrayal? And what do you think prevailing narratives get wrong about the Korean War, which, as you've mentioned, is sometimes called the Forgotten War?
I think that one of the things that I wanted to make sure I was going to do is decenter the narrative from what we know in history books, because we so easily fall into tropes of the valorous US, and this is what happened. So what I made sure to do, everything that's in the book has actually been from a survivor, whether it's a Korean survivor or a veteran, versus something that's in a book. So I just wanted to make, and then even like the small details when Youngman sees this particular movie with Young A, I made sure that movie was playing in Seoul. And so in some ways too, by doing this, it kind of helped create like the world actually started living on its own. Because in a weird way, when Parasite became so famous, it turned out that Bong Joon-ho, also this movie that Young Man sees as The Great Escape, it turns out that Bong Joon-ho saw that movie in Seoul when he was 13, and that became his sort of movie to become a movie maker. So there were just like these sort of coincidences that just helped me feel that, despite what the line is, the line has always been this: the US did not use biological weapons in Korea. However, there've always been rumors that they did, and there's a lot of CIA narratives. There's actually other books that are out about this. But for me, just hearing people saying, "Oh, this stuff fell out of the sky," and people would have seizures, and then also to see it actually in Bong Joon-ho's work. He does a lot of satire, but there's one scene in one of his movies where the same thing happens, and it makes me realize too. For me as an American, I'm also seeing it through this lens, like our government would never do something like this. Like it's too heinous to contemplate. But in Korea, that's just part of their cultural memory where it's in a funny movie. That's a Godzilla type movie. Like there's this one like throwaway scene like that. And I will mention somebody actually wrote a book on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, trying to get information. And one of the things he set himself as a task was to see if the US had used biological weapons. So I showed him that part of my book. He said, "How do you know all this?" I said, "I didn't know all this. People just said it. They were there." And the other point really being that, there's this whole thing, the people in the North are communists and, people in the South were the good guys. But actually, in the war, which I hope is I was able to present, people literally didn't know what was going on. You know what I mean? They were just like running for their lives, like barefoot into the winter all the time. Like they didn't understand. Just like, it was like kind of trippy for me when I was trying to interview my mother, who ended up not wanting to tell me very much. But she didn't even really understand what had happened after World War II, that why it was split and what happened with the colonization. Because she's still a kid. But even during the war, she didn't really understand like what was communism and what wasn't. And I'm realizing, yeah, why should she understand it? It's just happening to her. She doesn't have to study war and like geopolitics. Like for most people, they just were trying to stay alive.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point that the people on the ground don't have that global vision, or does it really matter when you're being bombed or starving? It doesn't really matter who's doing the bombing or the starving. The effect is the same. And in this book, which was a fascinating wartime history and of course an immigrant story that are both very moving, but it's also a very funny book. And it's a quite sharp-eyed satire that highlights the absurdities of modern culture, especially the American healthcare system. And Jungmann, who's an obstetrician, but after his hospital goes out of business, goes to work at a mall at a place called Depilation Nation, where unwanted hair comes to die, which I just loved. And I wonder if you could read us a bit about Jungmann's life as this, modern type doctor at the mall.
Sure. Basically, what has happened is Einstein, his son, is involved in this bro type startup. So he's trying to get his dad a gig. And so Young Man feels like he's trying to be useful. Let's see how it goes. Young Man had to take an employment test. You always did well on tests. Do you have any medical board violations or pending cases? Is your Minnesota license current? Are there any arrest warrants out for you? Or have you ever been convicted of a felony or spent any time in jail? Are you certified by the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology? What that had to do with administering vaccines, he didn't know, but he obediently answered. The blue haired lady graded his test and, apparently satisfied, sent him down the hall to another nondescript room with another middle aged woman. He put his resume down on the desk in front of her. Reggie, his grandson, had helped him put it together last night on the computer. She didn't even glance at it and instead asked to see his Minnesota license, his ACOG membership, his ABOG certification. And you don't have any tremor conditions like Parkinson's. Of course not. He was affronted. I'm a surgeon. No medical board or medical malpractice actions. No. She took his fingerprints. Why? Again, he didn't know. Young man was then given an address, a floor, a wing, a sector, a door number. He traversed the Skyway to the Mall of America and walked for what seemed like miles past Earring Pagoda, Orange Julius, Three Gaps, I Left My Heart in Minnesota, Victoria's Secret, Only in Minnesota, Forever 21, all fronted with riot gates, not oddly, not unlike the ones they had in Korea when demonstrations were commonplace. He saw no one as he strode past Nickelodeon Universe. Manic characters frozen in midair, roller coasters eerily stilled on their tracks. Door 12-0003 was a dark storefront, barred gates also in place, across from a gaudy mega restaurant, the Rainforest Cafe. Through the ambient light, he spied a single counter, like the check-in at an airline's gate. Next to the counter, the letters ATM glowed. He rattled the gate and called hello. From behind the counter, a dark-haired young woman detached from the gloom and motioned for him to go down the side hall where there was a small back door into the store. "You're late," she said, exasperated. "You know it's Black Friday, right?" She had a slight, unplaceable accent. Belarus? Moldova? Romania? She took his employment sheet and slipped it into a machine that sat behind the reception counter. Out popped a silicone wristband with a tiny holographic disc, which she then held underneath what looked like a supermarket price scanner. "Y Quack," read the LED display in cubular font. "Scan in, starts the clock." She gave him a clip on badge that said trainee. Hers said trainer. In the very back of the place was a small storefront, its shelves piled high with inventory. In the middle of it, on a folding table, a woman lay naked from the waist down in lithotomy position, her head propped up with one hand so she could check her phone. Young Man tried not to stare. Hi, she chirped from the table. Hello, Young Man said back. Nice to see you. This is Jenny, our standardized customer. They get one free treatment for volunteering. Why do we need a standardized patient? He asked. Normally, Maud administered the flu vaccines, but intramuscular injection was hardly something he could forget how to do. You have run a laser defolliculator number 2 before? She said with surprise. No, said Young Man. Now they're using lasers for vaccines? She turned to look at the clipboard he was carrying. Just to confirm, do you have a Minnesota State medical license? Any pending malpractice lawsuits or medical board actions? Any felonies? Yes, no, he said obediently. This was getting annoying. She handed him a white coat that said Spanish Mall-Based Medicine on the pocket. It's $10 a day to rent. I have one back at home, he said. Paying for a coat? Consistency across the brand, she said. We really have to hurry. Young Man sighed as she left to go make a copy of his credit card. When the trainer was gone, Young Man didn't know where to put his eyes, so he picked up a brochure from a pile. Make My Medical, grand opening. Specialized medical retail puts the treat back into treatment. Speedy dialysis, in-and-out chemo, USA Cancer Care, Depilation Nation, 4 Eyes LASIK and vision testing, Quick View MRI, Barry's Bariatric, now with Barry's Junior lap bands, Dome Depot, neurology and psychopharmaceuticals. Faster than the ER. Vaccines are us. Keep this. It's your only receipt. White coat, deposit, plus $500 incidentals at Depilation Nation. Depilation Nation, he said, looking up. We really need to start your training. The store opens. She checked her watch. In 15 minutes. I'm actually supposed to be administering vaccines at Vaccines Are Us. No, you're not. Yes, I am. Not according to your ID. Welcome to Depilation Nation, where unwanted hair comes to die. A Spanish medical retail outlet. Laser mustache, pubic hair depilation is less painful than waxing or tweezing. No annoying stubble. Clearer skin with less chance of infection. Physician administered for high safety standards. Perfect smoothness and permanent results, asterisk. Financing available, asterisk. Your results may vary. They don't have doctors at Vaccines Are Us, just nurses' aides and nurses. It was true that when in a hurry, sometimes he got his annual flu shot at the Walgreens. Some clerk did it. There was never a doctor in sight. OBGYNs work here, she said in her accented voice. I don't mean to sound flippant, he said. But depilation is even less of a medical procedure than vaccines. This is the exclusive FDA-approved machine for pubic hair depilation, and it requires a doctor to operate it. Pubic hair? Why would anyone want to depilate that? It is an elective health therapeutic. Young Man wanted to clutch his head. Health? Pubic hair cushioned and protected the sensitive area. Depilation was unhealthy for it. Folliculitis, various infections. How did he end up in this situation? Yes, it was Einstein, his son.
Wow. It's both this vision of medicine is both dystopian and hilarious at the same time, but it feels like near reality. And I'm curious what led you to train such a satirical eye on medicine. Is this your experience with the medical profession, or what kind of research did you have to do to get to this sort of view of medicine?
It seems speculative, but unfortunately, actually, a lot of it started to come true. Some of the other things that I included. And again, just sort of the serendipitous way that the book has unfolded, where I had this idea of things that I wanted to do. But one of the medical things that I did when I was teaching at Brown is I finally got somebody to embed me with the third year students doing their OBGYN clerkship. So I was able to basically do the clerkship with them. And because I was teaching there, the person, to make it easier, um, put me down as an instructor, and I had an attendings code, and I was just kind of had my parking pass and everything. But because of that, at some point, in my official emails, I was getting these emails from people going, "Hey, Dr. Lee, do you want to monetize your OBGYN practice? Come to Las Vegas and find out." So how could I not get on a plane and go to Las Vegas and find out what this is? So that's actually sort of serendipitously. I knew I wanted to do something like that, but then being able to do that, and not only did I not at that particular Las Vegas one, because I didn't lie, I said I'm not a doctor when I showed up. I said, "You invited me. I'm not a doctor. Just want to let you know." So I immediately got kicked out, like bodily. But I got kicked out at the same time with this other Asian American doctor who's apparently the rival to this father son team. And this guy, as we were getting kicked out like Bugs Bunny style, at the same time, we just started chatting, and I just told him what I was trying to do, and he said, "Oh, come to mine. It's going to be at the Mirabelle, like in Arizona." So 3 weeks later, I'm at the Four Seasons with complete access to everything, and it was even better because this man told all the people at the conference, like, "This person's here, so answer her questions." So just kind of, like, there's a line that what Einstein practices retail is in. It's retail plus medicine. Unfortunately, I would love to think that I made that up. I did not. That is something I got from the conference. And there were so many, but in a weird way, the satire itself is very toned down from what I actually saw. I mean, I had people in my face going, "Dr. Lee, pretend this steak is a vagina and look at this radiostatic like scalpel. There's very little heat damage." And just it actually the satire to make it work is literally was toned down from what I saw.
And I've always ignored those emails, so one of these days, maybe I'll go to Las Vegas and I'll have to check it out.
Right? It's like Tony Robbins has nothing on this. And but at the same time, despite like the weird details, what it meant to me too, though, was that what does it mean in our situation that we have people who are primary care providers who feel that it would be better to just do vaginal aesthetic surgery? And in trying to keep like an open novelist mind, I spent days with these people, and I understood a lot of them were like, "I have kids in college, so I'm doing this, or I can, if it's a business, I can do 3 surgeries at once." And do you know what I'm saying? So it skates this line where I get why they're doing it, and I was completely horrified.
Yeah, I think the two sections that you read really show the contrast between what you were saying about your father, who had this relationship with all of his patients, and he touched every one of them, as you said, to this other vision where it's so fragmented. There is a different store for every medical procedure, and the patient is not a patient; they're consumers, and they're choosing to what they want to spend their money on as consumers in terms of a medical service. Um, so I thought that was really striking. And also, I have to imagine you probably really had fun coming up with some of this stuff. I was, the Embros at the mall-based retail operator, but you're kind of
It was
having
definitely fun. It was
yeah,
fun.
yeah, having a little poke at the tech bro culture.
It's interesting the way you describe it. There are these different cultures within our society. I mean, medicine is its own culture, and people can be immigrants from, the healthy to the sick, and it's quite a culture shock as well. And I was actually going back to the idea of immigration. I was one thing that impressed me in the book is how accurately described the experience of the immigrant trying to be the exemplary American, right? How they're always trying to crack the code and it never seems to work. And I think all of us who have parents or grandparents who are immigrants, we can remember those sort of cringeworthy moments when we're teenagers, of course, and our parents mispronounce things or get the wrong cultural cues and we watch our relatives wrestle with, and they often fail to look and sound American. And Jungmann, he's endlessly frustrated. He's always trying to crack the code that Dr. Mitzner, the surgeon, seems to exude so naturally. And I wonder if you could talk to us about these two characters, the surgeon Mitzner and Jungmann, the OBGYN, and what their relationship was.
So in general, from what I've learned from being in the hospital, the surgeon is kind of the top person, just kind of naturally, because they do surgery. But I do understand a lot of doctors feel like, they're just carpenters. There's a little bit of a resentment. I love that each doctor has a name for the different specialist. But I did kind of get this idea that the surgeons at the top, and they tend to be, there's a certain sort of masculine cowboy aspect to that, which can be detrimental. And so I thought it was a perfect foil for Youngman because Mitzner is a little bit of the cowboy, manifest destiny kind of figure for him. And then Jungmann is in his Horatio Alger mode. I'm going to study, I'm going to know every English word. And yet he's like hearing the songs wrong and everything. And he's feeling like if only he was better prepared, he could ace this test of being an American. And then Misner is kind of a jerk. And then Youngman has this whole love-hate relationship, which is a little bit of a stand-in for his relationship with the US, where he hates Mitzner so much because Mitzner is a jerk. Like Mitzner's kind of racist. He's always kind of making fun of. He's calling him Dr. Quack and so forth. But at the same time, he is like the popular, like the mean girl in the town. So Youngman is desperately trying to be liked by him. So that's just kind of his. So it's kind of like he's the surgeon, the top guy, and then also he's kind of the exemplary American for all of the other reasons because he's kind of rich and everybody likes him. And it's always going to fall a little short, but Youngman's gonna do the Sisyphean thing and just try that someday he'll just get a medal or something. I'll say you're American now.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of the top of the hierarchy. I mean, he has all the power of being a surgeon and being the sort of, the model American. So, I mean, yeah, it makes sense that he would want to get some of that. But Youngman is not religious. He goes to church because he's trying to assimilate, and yet when he goes to his wife's Korean church meetings, he feels out of place. And these are all immigrants who vote conservatively. They're vocally anti-communist, and they're quote conservative immigrants who fancy themselves more patriotic than Republicans. But you write that Youngman seemed to have had few beliefs other than that he would outlive his brother. I wonder if you can talk about the kind of divisions in immigrant communities, and how do you think American politics and economics affect diasporic allegiances?
Oh, definitely. Because I think one thing people don't seem to realize is Korea is a minority Christian country. I think maybe 10% of people um, are Christian, but because of the certain networks at play, most of the immigrants who come here are Christian. And so within that, that kind of feeds into the being anti-communist. If you're anti-communist, you kind of become Republican, and because Republicans are really into the flag, it's kind of like almost a kind of reductive. Are you communist or not? Which is kind of how things have been operating in Korea post-war. You can rat on your neighbor for being communist, even though it doesn't even mean anything. It's communist or not, and kind of it makes these kind of signposts make it easier to be an immigrant because you can just be, are you Christian or not? Oh, Christian, not Christian is bad. Like again, Youngman also likes, even though he doesn't subscribe to the Christian part of it, he likes having signposts so he can know if he can be on the good side of things, like not tearing the tag off a mattress and so forth. And kind of similarly, my parents were also very Christian. And from a young age, I don't know why, but probably about the same time when I decided I was going to be a writer when I was 9, I decided I was Buddhist. And I didn't have a name for it. I didn't call it being Buddhist, but I meditated a lot. And then as I grew older, I realized I'm kind of participating in this kind of weird, kind of primal Korean religion that also has to do with talking to plants and things like that. But I've always felt very sure of it. And my parents would kind of flip out when they would see me doing like this practice. And I didn't understand what I was doing, but I didn't understand why they were flipping out. When I was doing like a lot of research in Korea, it makes me realize like polytheism or just like these porous borders of religion and spirituality, like the fortune teller, the face, Buddhism, Confucianism, it's just all people are really cool with it. And so like with my own experience, I was attending a Korean church for a while, but then the pastor finally told me that I couldn't be Buddhist and Christian. I had to choose. Where if you're Buddhist, they're fine. They're just chill. And so Youngman is a little bit more on that, he's just kind of interested in in everything. He doesn't have an allegiance. He doesn't have a particular spirituality, but he does know that he hates like the pompous sort of piety of the Korean church.
It was marvelous. I love that aspect of the book, and I actually want to turn the conversation a bit toward craft. Um, and I want to ask you a bit about your writing style. You have a very impressive way of compacting information into tight prose that is both informative but also creates character. And I was just going to read the last paragraph on page 2, which describes in Horse's Breath, the town in Minnesota. Into Horse's Breath, into Horse's Breath's mix of descendants of the immigrants brought to work in the iron ore mines, parentheses, Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, in that order, a Dane, 3 Icelanders, Slovakians, Slovenians, Serbians, Germans, Croatians, Poles, an Italian, and Irish or 2, and admixtures thereof. Into that mix came Dr. Quack, William, Will I Am, on his official documents, his Korean wife, Myung-Ok, and his Korean-ish son, Einstein. And that's the introduction to the book. And I found that paragraph just so wonderful that I got the whole global view and the Korean-ish son. And can you talk to us then a bit about your craft of writing?
It's very slow. And I think what I end up doing is trying every single thing until I get the one that I want. So I'd like to think that it was sort of intentional and so forth. But I think it was more finally I just flailed around enough. And there was a certain point where actually it seems weird now, but Einstein was the main character in the novel. And Youngman was just a filler in between the chapters. And so I think what happened precisely in 2016, when with all the anti-Asian rhetoric and then me thinking more deeply about how that affects me as an Asian American. And at that time, the novel was a lot more satire and a lot more funny, Middlemarch ish, like a novel of ideas. And I always kind of egotistically felt like, I want to write kind of like a guy novel, like big novel of ideas. Like I don't want to write like an immigrant novel. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but it's just, you know what I mean? Like this is I'm a woman writer and I kind of hate you get pigeonholed into this, oh, like she's gonna write this story about her grandma and she's gonna copy down her grandma's stories. But then it just made, but the book actually asserted itself and said it wanted to be about young man. So I actually, at that point in 2016, took it back from my editor because they were starting actually to get it into production. I took it back to my editor. I said, nah, I'm going to get started with young man. And then I just couldn't find a right entry into the story. And it just became this horrible thing until I think my editor suggested, why don't you do a prologue? And then when I just wrote various parts of it. And I think the difficult part too is that when you're writing, you already know everything, but you have to write it as if you don't know. Like I already knew everything about young man, but I already knew them. How do you express that? And I think that was like the most frustrating part because I actually I appreciate that you singled it out because that was that prologue that those 2 pages were some of the most difficult. Like I spent 60 days like just trying out stuff and it was wrong and not liking it until I came up with that. And I'm not even sure how I decided in the end that that was the right thing because I always look at it again and I'm like, I don't like it. You know what I'm saying? You're a writer. You always look at things again. You're like, one day you're a genius. The next day you're like, oh, I'm not sure this is good.
True, but 18 years, that is still quite an extended period of time to work on a novel. Did it change a lot over those years, or did the sort of nugget stay with it all along?
It's almost like the whole novel got completely replaced. One of the early editors who worked on it, he's such a brilliant editor. He ended up getting this big promotion. But then he wrote it to my agent when it came out. He said, "This is so strange." He said, "The entire novel is different. Like almost everything. Like even like the funny jokes I had like moved the whole novel around were gone. A lot of things that he loved were gone. But he said the tone and the heart of it was still the same." So no, it was completely, you know what I mean? It went first it was just Einstein, then it was Einstein Youngman, Einstein Youngman. And I was like, no, I have to just go for it. And I basically like rewrote the whole thing. But in a way, it was kind of like, I think it was good because by writing the Youngman as the filler, I was, you know how you feel like, oh, I'm writing, but the filler just, I was more relaxed and like playful with it. And so when his voice took over, I was actually kind of okay with being like, okay, you tell the story, I'll just write it down from here because his voice is so unique to me. And I even actually, when I was working at a friend's place in Brooklyn, I saw this guy that I thought that is what he looks like. I just had this moment. That's exactly what he looks like. So I just felt like he's there already. You know what I mean? I felt like he's there already. I'll just, work on it.
Yeah, I love that. And like you were saying about how this, young man, he's this, you look at him and he's this small Asian man, but he contains, multitudes. His story is just so rich and so full. And I love how you just kind of like, got pulled into his story. Although I do find the idea of an Einstein story kind of, that would be very different, very different story. And I'm sure you could do different things with that. Um, 18 years, what would you say was the most gratifying thing about working on this novel? And also the most difficult thing?
It was just something to come to every day. And I will mention, actually, to your prior question, one thing that did survive that when I read a story about how this guy had a 500-year-old ginseng root and someone ate it, I was like, I have to work that in somehow. So that was the one thing. It was just something that, I don't know. It was more like I couldn't stop till I got it right. Again, it was never right. And that was more what drove it. It just wasn't quite what I wanted. Just like I watched a whole year of medical malpractice trials and wrote a whole book. Like I had this end. I wrote it to the end. It was just not right. It really was more like that. And I really literally I'm doing a piece for poets and writers about being older and taking your time with stuff where you should hurry it up because you're getting older. But I actually literally wrote in my diary, enjoy this. This was when I was so mad and I was ready to just give up. You will regret this one day. Like you're going to miss this one day. I wrote this to myself. Like, when you do this, it's the opposite of what you're feeling. I literally at some point was so lost in the whole book. I had no idea what it was about anymore. I couldn't hold the book in my head that I was actually thinking of just giving up, like paying back the advance. But I just wrote this note. You are going to miss this. And I have to say, now that it's been like 6 months from publication, the book tour is like toning down a bit. Now that I'm sort of flailing for the next idea, I am missing that daily. I had somewhere to go and I had this idea. Like I am actually feeling it. Am I going to have another idea that's going to drive me for 18 years? Like I didn't think it was going to take 18 years, obviously, when it started, but it did drive me for 18 years. Like it was a living thing that I just came to for 18 years. And now I'm just so grateful that it's out.
And here it is, folks, the evening hero. Thank you so much, Marie, for this really wonderful conversation. And you can get your copy of The Evening Hero at BLR's bookshop, and a portion of the purchase price will go to BLR. This is the Bellevue Literary Review, our journal that comes out twice a year with writings, fiction, poetry, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And I hope you'll check out blreview.org. Maybe you'll check out and become a subscriber. Thank you, Marie, MyungOk Lee, and thank you, Doris Cheng, for joining us. And we'll see you all at the next event. Bye now.
Thank you so much.